All right, next session is about community building and how to incentivize your community to contribute meaningfully to your project. And we've got Christian, head of ecosystem at Superform. If you guys care about community building, you definitely want to stick around for this one.
I'm just going to do my full screen. Cool. Hello? That sounds pretty good. Thank you. How do I get the, can you put me on the screen? There we go. Hey everybody, my name's Christian Dumas and I'm the head of ecosystem at Superform. Superform is the user-owned neobank. I was approved to do this talk about 2 months ago and it was always going to be about incentives, but Superform launched a token a week ago. So I've learned a lot about incentives and outcomes, I think, and I'm going to add some of my reflections to the talk as well. Also, very topical and timely, just a few days ago, Vitalik made a tweet about incentives. He was responding to someone who was effectively saying, if you don't incentivize your users, you won't have any users. And he didn't agree, he had a response to it, it was quite long, but one of the core arguments was this here, that good incentives are things that compensate users for temporary costs or risks that they take for being early to what you're building. Whereas bad incentives are things that bring people to your product that would never even use a mature version of your product. So we want to reward people for being early, for putting their capital at risk, for putting their reputation at risk, for being early and supporting us in early days. But we don't want to reward people who are just going to leave the second we stop paying them to be here. So instead of rewarding these inputs that we often have focused on our reward systems, capital, noise, attention, instead we want to reward outcomes. So we need to define, like, what are those outcomes? What are the things that we actually want to be working towards in the long term? This is a bit of an oversimplification, but for the purpose of this talk, I have this model where we have 2 ways to contribute to a crypto product. We have financial contributors who put their capital at risk, and the outcomes are pretty easy to define, a sticky TVL, for example. And then we have the labor contributors, and they don't have as much capital to put up, but they contribute with their time and their effort and their creativity. And the incentives shape their behavior quite quickly, but these outcomes are harder to define. So I'm going to focus on that mostly today. And why is it harder to define? This is also an oversimplification. We could argue about it, but for all intents and purposes, 1 ETH deposited into a DeFi protocol by me is the same as 1 ETH deposited into a DeFi protocol by you for the purpose of incentivization and how it affects our protocol in the long term. Whereas a community contributor, like Alice's contributions, are going to be very different from Bob's contributions, and we have to figure out how to properly measure these different contributions and determine not just how they impact our short-term goals, but our long-term goals that we're trying to achieve as a company. And just a quick note on like short-term incentives versus long-term users. If your incentives reward short-term behavior, then you're not going to have long-term users. So we can measure this in a few ways. There's trade-offs. So speed versus durability. Speed would be like how quickly can we get people to do things? How quickly can we bootstrap our community? Versus durability. You know, how durable are these users? Will they stick around when you stop paying them? Activity versus trust. Activity is just like number of posts, number of transactions, number of quests completed, things like that. Versus like trust, which is this long-term trust that the users have in the team. They have this long-term alignment. They'll be your supporters even when things go wrong. And then we have reach versus retention. Reach is engagement. How many likes do you have on the tweet? Versus like retention. Do these people, do they keep coming back? Are they long-term users? Are they long-term content creators? So these are things we think about, and often we incentivize the former and not so much focused on the latter. You probably all heard of InfoFi, and this was a point that Vitalik made in the tweet as well. Essentially, if you pay people to make tweets, that's like the perfect example of like a bad incentive, right? So I think like you still want some kind of incentivization. You want people to create content for you. That's important. You want your users to be creating cool stuff that promotes what you're building as your #1 fans. But you don't want this like short-term extractive behavior where you're giving incentives away to people who are just going to leave the second you stop paying them. There's no long-term alignment there. And Superform did do an InfoFi campaign, and we wish we didn't, and we learned a lot of lessons from doing it. But I think Vitalik's spot on that this is like a pure example of like a wrong thing to do in just let's pay people to tweet, right? So some reflections on the airdrop at Superform. We had this like elaborate incentive structure that we built. Again, we're talking about specifically like community participants, not necessarily like financial participation, but we incentivized everything, or so I thought, and had this like quantified model of community contribution in content creation, evangelism, community support, events, product usage, all these things. But ultimately, we were optimizing for those short-term things we didn't want to optimize for, right? For speed, for activity, for reach. And what this did was it attracted mercenary users, people who optimized their behavior around rewards. They were only there for the financial gain, and there was no downside for them leaving, right? Like they could just come in, optimize their behaviors to get the most rewards out of our system, and then leave whenever we stopped incentivizing them or it wasn't convenient or efficient for them to do so. And then the note on InfoFi here is that we promised tokens to unaligned users who they didn't really care what Superform, they was trying to make money. And if we don't pay them, they won't be here. So what happened after the airdrop? Some reflections. Motivation dropped. All the rewards when we're incentivizing this like short-term behavior, these rewards were optimized for like the pre-airdrop with no transition from this extrinsic motivation, financial, to intrinsic motivation, getting people long-term aligned and having, again, incentivizing these outcomes that we're looking for. And we had a lot of people who left, and honestly, a lot of them were short-term, incentive-driven people. They were optimizing for ROI, not the broad Superform mission. But that, again, we designed the incentives to enable them to do so. And then the saddest thing that happened was even our core contributors, the ones who were really aligned with Superform, they did believe. Of course, everybody's a little bit incentivized by money, but these people, they were along for the ride, down for the mission. But at the end of the day, their long-term effort wasn't properly differentiated from these short-term mercenary users. And then after the airdrop happened, there wasn't this clear what's next? What are the next steps? How can I continue to help push towards this mission that I do believe in? So they had this alignment, but it wasn't properly recognized or reinforced. And that's something that we're going to correct going forward, so that these people still feel like they're valued and still help us drive towards our outcomes. And that's the key here is what are these outcomes? And we have to define them, because if we don't define what our long-term goals are for the community, then the incentives will define them for us. And these are, this might be different depending on what your community is, who your users are, what you're actually trying to optimize for. But some things that are pretty general, I think, is retention. Do people stick around after you stop paying them to be there? Alignment. Are they not just short-term extractors? Are they there for the same thing that you believe in? Do they believe in the mission? Trust. Do they trust the team? Will they be your defenders when things go wrong, either technically or reputationally? Will they put their own reputation on the line to support you because they believe in what you're building? Do they feel like owners? Do they feel like they have a say in what you're doing, in what you're building? Do they feel like part of the team? And all this drives long-term value creation, right? Just paying someone to make a tweet, that's not going to be useful in the long term. There's nothing really to be gained from it. A little bit of attention, but that fades very quickly. So all this drives to long-term value creation, and we want to incentivize these things. We don't want to incentivize short-term behaviors. We want to incentivize these outcomes, these long-term goals that we have. So we want to design systems that do that. And we tried to do that at Superform, and I think we did some things well and some things not well at all, and we learned a lot of lessons. And this is like my thinking on like how can we do better as we go forward. So. Some tools that I think are interesting. I'll just talk about a couple things that I think are kind of cool that you can use to try to measure and reward outcomes. I like the idea of proxy tokens. So these are like not your official protocol token. They're like a temporary measure to assess community engagement without giving actual ownership. There's not any like guaranteed value or like financial implications necessarily. And then we can use this to like observe behavior. Like if I give you a token, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to hold it? Are you going to stake it? Are you going to sell it? How long are you going to hold it for? Are you going to buy more? We can look at all these things, and we can kind of use that as a proxy for if we reward this person, like what will they do with those rewards? Or are they someone who is actually long-term aligned? So we did this with, we had our Piggy community loyalty token, which then was a proxy for UP. We were inspired by the PER token from Hyperliquid. And another example, I like Stargate and Layer 0. So it's not exactly the same, but Stargate was like a governance token. But at the end of the day, Layer 0 was able to use it as a proxy for what their users would do once they gave them the ZRO tokens. And ultimately, STG is now convertible for ZRO, and it's been like acquired by Layer 0. And then one more thing is guild roles. So I really like Guild as a product. For those of you who don't know, it's like helps you to, you can kind of collect these like on-chain and off-chain contributions and earn like roles and get rewards. And this is really helpful to quantify community impact. You can incentivize like a wide range of things and then turn it into this like leaderboard of your community's participation. And it turns the behaviors into signals that we can reason about and make decisions on. The problem, the way we implemented it was still we're incentivizing for this short-term activity, for these actions that don't actually lead to long-term meaningful outcomes. And we counted what people did, but not like why they did it or what it ultimately led to. And so the roles, they shouldn't reward activity, they should reward these outcomes that we're trying to work towards. So some ideas of roles and how we can kind of fit that into this model of outcomes. We can go back to these proxy tokens that can signal alignment and ownership, but these need to be, these roles should be earned through sustained contribution over time, both off-chain and off-chain, and persist beyond any single campaign. We want like a long time period to measure this person's behavior of what they'll do with incentives and how they're aligned. Are they creating content around this token? Are they helping to support the token economy and ecosystem? Content roles, we talked about InfoFi. We don't really like that, but still you want people to create content. So what can we do? We want to reward like durable knowledge, content that like persists over time, that provides value over time, and emphasize like quality and reusable content. And we want to be able to track impact on like understanding, not just raw impressions, and maybe incorporate protocol usage as a multiplier or something like that. Like, instead of just like paying for views, like how can we ensure this is an aligned person who is also creating very beneficial content that helps many people over the long term, and then give them rewards for doing so. And then you want your ambassadors, you want your community champions, and this represents like trust and retention, but this needs to be based on like consistency, reliability, follow through, focus on relationships, and not simply paying somebody to like be your ambassador for a few months, and then when you stop paying them, they leave. Like how can we retain this person for the long term and make sure that they feel like a valued part? Going back to all these things, this ownership mentality, all these outcomes we're trying to optimize for. So, with all that in mind, a big question might be like, will people still contribute if you stop paying them to do so? Will they engage without any incentives? Honestly, I think not really. Maybe in the long term, like if you have a really valuable product, then yes. But if we're focused on like community members who are creating content for you, who are being your brand ambassadors, I don't think the incentives should disappear entirely. Rather, they should evolve. And we can look at non-financial perks. I think that like credit card points and like airline points are a really good example of like kind of something we could look at. So you can give people non-financial perks like exclusive access to the team, or like early access to products and new features, give them status within the community, this sense of ownership and like influence over the direction of what you're building. And all these things we want to, again, reward these specific outcomes that we're trying to achieve, these long-term goals, with maybe as over time, not financial gain, but specifically these non-financial perks. And one final note, ultimately, Vitalik's final message is the bulk of the effort should be on making an actually useful app. And this is something Superform is really committed to, despite all the noise. At the end of the day, we just want